Hi AP Seminar, Mr. Muller here, and in today's video we're going to continue to look at proper researching techniques. In our last couple of videos we talked about how to develop a research question and a working thesis. We also talked about how you can find sources for that working thesis, and in this video we're going to talk about how to evaluate and record these sources so that you can then write your argumentative assignment or make that documentary or music video or interpretive dance, whatever it needs to be. Hope you're excited. I'm excited. Let's get started. Now, the first thing we have to do is determine, so let's say you've got all these sources, and they could be from a lot of different places. Magazines, they could be from peer-reviewed journals, they can be books, they could be data. But how do we determine how relevant these sources are going to be for our working thesis? Now, when you get your working thesis down, before you even start using your researching methods, what you probably want to do are create some guidelines for what you're looking for in these sources. For instance, if we're going to be looking on the NCAA's policy on giving money to student athletes, which has been a controversial topic in the United States in college athletics for a number of years, think about the guidelines that we're going to need for that. Well, I'm going to need sources about the benefits and the disadvantages of this program. I'm going to need sources from people who want this and don't want this. I'm going to need to look at the history of college athletics in a scholarship versus a pay-to-play program. I'm going to have to look at the economic aspects of it, the social aspects of it. I'm going to need to look at the demographics of most of the time, who are these college students? What background do they come from? So you're going to really have to create some guidelines of what you're looking for in your sources, instead of necessarily just going around and trying to find something that could be relevant. So here are some other guidelines that you want to think about as you're researching for your working thesis. Do you need to look at primary or secondary sources? Or both? Or would secondary sources not even be relevant to what you're looking at? The sources that you find, do they actually address your question? If they don't, I'm not saying necessarily throw them away, but you really don't want to focus on them. Does the source support your thesis? Or does it disagree with your thesis? If it agrees, you may just want to use it to support what your claim is. If it disagrees, then what you're going to do is use that as a counterclaim to what your argument is. Does it add significant information, or is it really relevant? If it's not really adding anything to bolster your argument, throw it out. Is the source current? If it is so old that it's really actually going to be a hindrance to your argumentative product, don't use it. What bias do you see? Because if you do see some, you need to address it in the argumentative essay, or find other sources that will corroborate what that biased source is trying to tell you. So how do we know, once we get all these sources together, if they're actually good quality? Here's the important thing. If it's a website, don't trust it. Come into it with an attitude of this is probably biased, this may not be reliable, this probably isn't credible. Because if you're going into it saying, well, anything that I can find on Google will be worthwhile, you're not going to do well on this argumentative product. The most reliable sources are scholarly journals, we've talked about that multiple times, and government websites for hard data. Now, the reasons why we're always directing you to peer-reviewed journal entries, either in electronic databases or in published professional journals, is not only because they're peer-reviewed, but because they also have a great works cited page, because they have to cite the sources they're using in their paper. So if you're looking at a topic similar to a professional journal article and they're listing all these other sources they're using, that's a great jumping off point to find further sources on that particular topic. Now, there are two different types of sources that we can look at. We've talked about this multiple times: primary and secondary sources. So depending on the topic that you have, you're going to be looking for a majority of either primary or sometimes secondary sources. You always want to stick with primary because primary adds a lot more credibility to your argument because it's the original source. Secondary sources are very valuable because they will corroborate what you're trying to say. It's like having a reinforcements if you're fighting a battle. You know, it's not so great if you've just got the original work, have some other people to back you up in what you're saying. Now, as you start to actually get your list of sources together, and now you got to read. And this takes a long time, but as you're reading, you need to read critically. You're not just reading to understand, you need to read with a purpose. So here are some things that you really need to think about as you're reading these sources. And this slide is very important. I put a big star next to this because this is something you're always going to have to keep in mind as you're doing your research. First, think about who the source is. Where is this necessarily coming from? Is it peer-reviewed? Is it from a government website? Is it from a newspaper? Because that's going to tell you, again, your readers, keep in mind what they think. If they are going to be very, very wary of particular news sources, do you really think they should be used? Think about the author. Is that author qualified to talk about this subject? If they have a degree in economics, but not necessarily international trade, and yet they're talking about international trade, well, your counterclaims, think about how people could object to that. Well, you're citing this guy as a source, but he's not even focused on this. He's focused on another field. Why aren't you using people that are experts in that particular type of economic field? Also, try to understand the content. You have to understand the argument about this topic. So, of course, you need to understand what's going on there. Understand the author's purpose. Why is he writing this? Do you detect any bias in this source? Go through the strategies for summarizing arguments. It will give you a great understanding of the conversation. And what does the author not address? Think about that as well. Because they might only be telling you a certain part of this story in terms of the topic or the thesis that you're trying to research. So what's not being addressed? Think about, again, taking roles of a skeptic, of a contributor, of someone who agrees with this. Try to have those different roles as you're reading to try to come up with even counterclaims as you're reading this. It'll give you a much better understanding of the conversation of this topic. Now, I'm not going to go through this entire checklist here for you, but you might want to just take a picture of this, keep it somewhere in your notes, maybe print this out. This is a great checklist for trying to evaluate sources. And it can be based on, again, the source, the author, timeliness, evidence, biases, advertising. Just think about some of these checklist ideas here as you're looking through these sources as well, because it is imperative that you are reading these sources critically so that you can truly understand the topic. Now, something important is evaluating web sources. Again, the dot whatever. Now, of course, you know we're not supposed to really be looking at .coms. There's a lot of bias that can come from that. They're really not peer-reviewed, very uncredible. However, there's some other things we have to keep in mind. So let's talk about the other web sources. First, you've got EDUs. These are from educational institutions. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they're credible. You have to make sure it comes from the research center of that institution, because remember, colleges are a business. They're trying to put out a certain product. If they're not putting out hard data from their research center, you probably don't want to trust them. Another web source you can use is government. These are very credible. They are fact-checked because it is a government website. Again, this is great for hard data and statistics. Now, .orgs, you got to be careful with. Some people think .orgs are great, but you have to understand that .org references a non-profit organization. In one sense, they are more reliable than .coms, but they could have a certain agenda. So you have to research this organization, find out what their mission statement is, find out what they believe, and really be able to address are their results biased because of the cause they are supporting or trying to change. There are two more you can look at: military, which is also good for hard statistics and data, and .net, which is a network. Anyone can use a .net, so in my mind, I would completely wouldn't even consider a .net. So those are some of the other web-based sources that you can look at. Think about them critically as you're reading them as well. Well, that was actually a pretty short video. Hope you learned something you did not know before about evaluating sources. Good luck reading. Thanks for watching.